All right, good afternoon. A hot, sultry afternoon. Thank you for coming in spite of the heat. So we continue with the series on the myth and mind, and the intention of this series, as shared in the previous lectures, was to relook at mythology from around the world and look at how do we connect with it now in today's context, one from a space of personal healing and personal connection in terms of what do I have to learn from the stories, to also for us to look at how do we look at mythology from a social healing perspective. How do we look at it from the socio-political context, from the current economic context that we're going through. So today's myth is about the Greek hero Prometheus. So we're jumping a bit from the Indian stories that we've been looking at in the last couple of lectures in this series. So far what we've looked at is, in the first part of the series, we looked at the septenary framework that Helena Blavatsky had proposed and looked at mythology from that perspective in terms of what do we really mean by layers of caste, for example, in the Indian context, or layers of the body from a somatic perspective. And how do we explore mythology from that perspective? And in the last talk, we looked at Arjuna as an archetype and what does it mean for us here and now. Today we move into the Greek pantheon and look at the story of the Titan Prometheus. And the story is interesting and extremely layered and complex. And it's interesting to also look at the parallels in Oriental and particularly Indian mythology. So Prometheus, it is said, was one of the Greek titans, and much like we have in the Indian mythology, you have the deities and then there's the gods. So the deities being like the lesser gods. The titans were more human-like and the gods were more divinized in the stories. And it is said that the god Zeus at one point took over and defeated the titans and started ruling over Mount Olympus being the city of the divine. Right? So he established his rule over earth, so to say, through Mount Olympus, and he pretty much killed all his other enemies, all the other titans, except for Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus. And there are several versions of the story in terms of why were these two kept alive. Largely, most of the versions agree that Zeus had a special affection for both of them, given the qualities that they possessed, and they were supposed to be good human beings at heart. So if we start with the names themselves, there's Prometheus and there's Epimetheus. If you look at the suffixes pro and epi, pro is something that comes before, and epi is something that comes after. Like if you look at the prologue of a book and the epilogue of a book, right? And if most scholars would agree that the names are meant to indicate Prometheus as in forethought, somebody who thinks before he acts, and Epimetheus, somebody who acts and then thinks later. Right? So two brothers, but with fairly opposing views to life. So one thinks a lot and then figures what is the right kind of action, and one tends to act brash and then figures the consequences of his action at a later point in time. So these two brothers are allowed to exist by Zeus. Interesting, if you look at, Prometheus, if you're familiar with the tale, what he's most known for is the fact that he was the one who stole fire from the gods and brought it to humans. Right? If you look at if you go back to the Rig Veda, the Sanskrit, not so much Sanskrit actually, pre-Sanskrit, the Vedic term Pramat is thief, and Prometheus in Greek mythology is regarded as a thief of fire. Right? interestingly, again, if you go back to the Rig Veda, Pramath is another name for Agni, fire. Right? So there's some connection going back there in that the term seems to be a Proto-Indo-European root. It's not just a pure Greek term. There's also some Vedic origin to it. From the Rig Veda, the moment you come down the ages to the Atharva Veda, Pramath also includes other elements. So Pramath is sometimes used to indicate wind, it's sometimes used to indicate water, but originally it seems to indicate fire. So there's some connection there. And you also find similar characters in other myths around the world aside from the Greek myths. So essentially, so these two were given the task after Zeus conquered Mount Olympus. He started ruling the world. He gave the task to these two brothers to say, you need to go down to the planet, sculpt from clay living beings, different kinds of species that can now inhabit the planet under the rule of Zeus. And so these brothers go down and start their work. Along the way, Zeus also gives Epimetheus a bag of gifts and says that once you've created these living beings, you can give them some of these gifts as you deem appropriate. Now, Epimetheus, being true to his name, he starts creating different kinds of animals, and as he's creating, he also starts giving them gifts that Zeus gave them. So to some animals he gave a very keen sense of hearing, to some of them he gave a nice hot warm fur so that they can live in cold climates. To some other animals he gave a lot of strength and fortitude. So he kept giving away a lot of these gifts as he created them without so much thought. Prometheus, on the other hand, was really careful as he sculpted human beings, and he did not give anything away. But by the time Prometheus finished creating and looked to Epimetheus to say, okay, what are the gifts that are left that can be given to humans, he realizes that there's nothing left. Now he's really sad for his creation, the human, because they're left to live with all these animals around them who seem to have a lot of gifts, and therefore they are stronger, they have a keener sense of sight and hearing and protection. On the other hand, the human being is very fragile in the environment that he's created for, and therefore he ends up being the prey for the predators around him. Out of compassion, Prometheus goes back to Zeus and says, this is not fair, we need to give something to human beings, and there's nothing of the gifts left now. So what is it that we can give? Can we give some fire so that they can protect themselves? Zeus says, no, fire is meant for gods. You cannot bring down fire to human beings because that's what distinguishes a god from human, and humans are the lesser race, and therefore we can't give them that. So Prometheus comes back dejected. He still continues to work with his fellow human beings. And one day, out of compassion, he decides to trick Zeus. And he goes up to the chariot of the sun, steals an ember, brings it back to the earth, and gives fire to human beings. And it is said that that act of stealing fire from the gods and that act of compassion of Prometheus is what led to civilization as we know it, because through fire then human beings created other things like cooked food and tools and industrialization. So it was that spark of the fire that was brought down which created civilization as we know it. Right. Now, the story is interesting from an allegorical perspective in terms of looking at what does fire mean. Right? Fire, if we look at it as a metaphor, could be the fire of discernment, it could be the sense of judgment which allows humans to protect themselves better against the predators that were around them. It is the fire of knowledge that allows them to start thinking about what's more to life, what is my purpose, and therefore live more meaningfully. It is also that inner sense of purpose, igniting that inner fire which makes life meaningful. Right? And it is said that, so Zeus doesn't initially recognize that the fire has been stolen. It is only later when he realizes that because now humans are sorted in terms of their existence on the planet, because of the fire and the protection that it gives them and the way it facilitates life, then they start looking up to the sky and say, okay, now that there's the idea of God, that there is something more to life than survival, and therefore we need to look at reconnecting with God. And then they start reaching back to Zeus, and that's when he realizes, oh, they've stolen fire and now they're trying to come towards me, which is not something that he wanted. Right? And therefore, as a punishment to Prometheus, he decides to chain this guy up on Mount Caucasus and he's condemned to eternal damnation. Right? Now Prometheus is a titan, he cannot be killed, he's immortal, and therefore his punishment is that he will stay alive, but he'll stay tied up to the mountain with an eagle being a representation of Zeus, coming down and pecking his liver every day. And overnight the liver cells grow back, it heals, and next day the eagle comes back and the process starts again. So it's this eternal process of the eagle eating his liver every day, making sure that he undergoes pain. And from Zeus's perspective, it was about saying, if you have so much compassion for human beings who endure pain, you may as well undergo the pain yourself if compassion is so dear to you. Right? And the organ liver is particularly chosen because the Greeks believed that the liver is the seat of consciousness. It's a seat of emotion and compassion, and therefore if your liver's hit, that's when you experience the most pain. Right? So, and of course the term liver from an English perspective again has it's a pun, it's a dual meaning in terms of the person who lives being the liver. Yeah. So, and if you go back to Ayurveda, again liver has a similar connotation in terms of it being the seat of emotion, and the moment there is a lot of emotional impact and stress, the liver tends to get impacted. So Prometheus goes through this for centuries together, where every day the eagle comes in, pecks his liver, goes back, overnight he heals, eagle comes back again, eagle as a messenger of Zeus. Interestingly, if you go back to Rig Veda, again, the term Pramath at a later point down in the Samveda also means son of Garuda, son of eagle. So there's again some connections going back and forth there. And this process goes on till Hercules, or Heracles as he's known in the Greek myths, Hercules in the Roman myths. One of his 12 labors is to go fetch the golden apple from a place near to where Prometheus is tied up. So in the process of his 11th labor, he happens to come across Prometheus and then helps him, he kills the eagle, unchains him, and Prometheus is freed at some point in time. So while the story has many layers and a lot of complexity, what I'd like to leave us with is this really simple piece in terms of what happens to those that bring fire to our lives. If we have to look at our social context, people that bring fire, people that bring a sense of consciousness, awareness, for example, Nelson Mandela in his time saying that apartheid is not okay and everyone should be treated equally, bringing in that sense of fire, of igniting a new sense of hope. What happens to someone like him? What happened to someone like a Gandhi in India? Or what happens to social activists in our world today who are fighting for different causes, which could be environment or animals or the planet in general, right? And there's that continued myth of the Prometheus constantly flowing in terms of these activists being prosecuted till there is some Hercules who comes in much later and then frees them in some way. Mandela had to spend those 27 years in prison till he was freed. So the myth lives on. Right? So when we're talking about reinterpretation of mythology, it's about looking at it not so much as a story that happened once upon a time, but an eternal story that we seem to live as a human race over and over again, much like we spoke about Arjuna and the battle of Kurukshetra happening over and over again on a day-to-day basis. There's Prometheus happening in our lives over and over again. If you have to further drill down from the society into us as individuals, what happens to parts of us that have awakened to the light, and therefore they're trying to make sure that the rest of us also follows into the light, also starts living more consciously, more strongly, in a more aware manner? What happens to that part of us? What's the cost of that fire? So, and in our day-to-day lives, the Prometheus in us tends to struggle and is often persecuted, right? And we try different ways in which the Prometheus lives. It could live in the form of sometimes, us following some spiritual practices. For some of us, it's about taking up a social cause. And then one needs to come back home. One needs to come back to ground reality or go back to a job, and then face the repercussions of one's belief around the world. Right? So those are questions that don't really have answers. These are inner answers that we need to find, but the intention of the talk, of course, is to stir up questions more than give answers. But yes, the point at the end of it is, what's the cost of the fire that we are alive to? The parts of us that knows that there's a higher truth, the parts of us that knows that there is a larger connection with other human beings beyond race, religion, gender, and everything else that divides us. What happens when we speak up about our beliefs? How is our Prometheus chained somewhere in our own minds? And one way to process this is, for those of us who work with the idea of internal family systems, looking at different characters that exist within us. Look at what part of me is the Prometheus, what part of me is the Zeus, and what part of me is perhaps the Hercules that is trying to rescue it. Okay. So it's a deep exercise when one goes into it. Personally, for me, if I have to share an example, I find that there's the idea of Prometheus that wants to focus on maybe working for the planet, looking at larger causes, looking at peace building and focusing on that work. And there is another part of me that says, stay practical, pay your bills, earn money, and therefore come back from that space. And in that process, the Prometheus is, well, I wouldn't say chained, but partly exiled, in terms of saying, you shut up, and when things are convenient, we'll come back to you. And then somewhere there's the Hercules that keeps trying to rescue it back and bring it back into mainstream life. So that's the inner struggle that we live with, another version of the battle of Kurukshetra that fights in us. Right? So yeah, that's what I leave you with today. What's the cost of your fire? What's the cost of your enlightenment or your awareness? And how do you pay for it? And how do we rescue the Prometheus back? Yeah. So deep questions, so not seeking answers, but leave you with that. Yeah. Thank you.